Hey guys, Manasseh here. So I'm going to try and help you guys out by just going over the lab exercise and how I did it. So, first question, they ask you, you are the security manager for MyCorp. Your team performs a risk assessment for three information assets. Table 1, the risk assessment data identifies the information for the three assets. Using the data presented in Table 1 risk assessment data, which asset should be evaluated first for additional protocols? Why? Why? Which asset evaluated last? Why? Okay. Now for this one, okay, yeah, I did end up saying that the router should be evaluated first. Now with this table, in one of the pages, I want to say like 294 or something like that. They go over things like likelihood and like these numbers, these percentages, and well, the percentages are switched to decimal form or just number form. So yeah, that'll help with you understanding these numbers here next to the vulnerabilities. So for number one, I said that the router should be evaluated for additional controls. Um, I said it because it's susceptible to hardware failure with a 30% chance of that happening, and it also impacts a high percentage of the company and has no current controls in place to either reduce the impact of the company or the vulnerability's likelihood. I said that here because so in the table you have the asset, the purpose, and the list of potential vulnerabilities, and the percentage is just lacking the percent sign, the percentage of the impacts of the company, and the current controls in place with also the certainty. So with that, if you look at the assets individually and then compare all these, you'll end up seeing that the router is the one that you would most likely need to evaluate first, due to the fact that one of the two vulnerabilities, it has one of the highest percentages in the table. Period. It also doesn't have any current controls in place. Current controls, I don't know if you guys read the chapter, but controls is just another way to say protections or, just things that you have in place to protect that specific asset. And yeah, and so the percentage of that likelihood of this vulnerability happening and also the impact to the company. The reason why I didn't say the web server, and even though it has the highest percentage of impacting the company, there are controls in place already that reduce the impact of the vulnerability by 85%. So really, this 99% isn't 99. It really should be what 14%, really. And its vulnerabilities has a low likelihood compared to the router as well. So with that, yeah, like I said before, I said the router should be evaluated first and the web server last, because of it having low impact to the company and low percentage for the vulnerability, the likelihood of that vulnerability actually going through. Okay, so for the second question, your MyCorp team performed a risk assessment on a new project evaluating the project against 10 threat categories. Table 2, threat occurrences slash costs, presents the assessment of results. So, using Table 2, calculate the ARO and ALE for each category. Okay, so I'm not sure if you guys read the chapter, and I'm not going to blame you. I skimmed some of the chapter, pretty much every module, just to get some of the important information, and then if I like it enough, I'll go back and read the whole thing. So basically, for this table, there's two formulas, really just one formula, that you need to get this done. So first things first, they want you to calculate the ARO. The ARO is short for the annual rate of occurrence. And the annual rate of occurrence is just a sophisticated way of saying how many times does this thing happen annually. Annually means yearly. So how many times does this thing happen within a year, right? So, for example, let's look at this first row here in this threat category, loss of intellectual property. The frequency of occurrence, you'll start here. The frequency of occurrence is once per year, one per year. So in this incident, loss of intellectual property happens once per year, right? So how many years are in a year? How many 1 years are in a year? One, right? That might be a bit trippy, so let's try this one. Theft of information by an employee, right? So this incident happens once every 6 months, right? How many 6 months are in a year annually, right? 2. That's why I have this number here. I don't know if you guys I already have filled out this table and all that stuff, so you will get to this eventually later. But you see the pattern here, right? Let's do this other one. Programming mistakes. This happens once per week. How many weeks are in a year? 52. So that means the ARO for this threat category that happens once per week is 52, right? So that number is extremely important once we want to calculate the ALE, right? So you can find the ALE by multiplying the ARO by the SLE, which is this number here. And the SLE is the cost per incident, right? So let's go back up here to the top. So for this threat category, loss of intellectual property, the SLE for that threat category is $50,000 per incident, right? So to find the ALE, we'll need to, like I said before, multiply the ARO times the SLE. So for the ARO for this one is 1, right? So we'll do 50,000 times 1. And the ALE would be $50,000, right? Let's do this next one after that. Theft of information by a hacker. The SLE for this incident is $5,000. Frequency of occurrence is once per quarter. There's 4 quarters in a year, which means that we'll do 5,000. So that means the ARR is 4. So that means we'll do 5,000. The SLE is 5,000 times 4. 5,000 times 4 is 20,000. That's how we'll get the ALE. So I'm hoping you guys understand that well. I don't want to spend too much time going through the whole thing. Excuse me. So for the next question, they're asking, how might my corp company arrive at the values in the table shown in exercise 2? For each entry, describe a potential process of determining the cost per incident and frequency of occurrence. So basically for this one, I pretty much explained how I got these numbers, did the formulas for the ARO and ALE. And it also asks, that second part of the question, describe a potential process of determining the cost per incident and frequency of occurrence. In the book, I think it is on 304 that they mentioned how they even determined what the SLE would be, which is the cost per incident. So the formula for the SLE, which I don't think you'll be using ever in this chapter, is the asset value multiplied by the exposure factor. So you can say for that second half of the question that they determine the cost per incident and frequency of occurrence by looking at the asset value and exposure factor for that specific asset, and looked at recent incidents and within the company, how that was handled, what the expenses were, and also looking at similar companies that have faced this incident, and come up with this estimation of what these values would be. Right? Okay, so for the fourth one, a year's passed. MyCorp improves security by implementing controls. Using the information in exercise 2 and the data in table 3, control data, calculate the post-control ARO and ALE for each threat category listed. So in this table here, it's literally the same thing. It's almost the same thing, but they added 2 more columns, and this is my 2 columns that I added to answer the question, right? So if you realize the numbers have changed, some of these numbers have changed, right? The cost per incident, has pretty much stayed the same, but the frequency of occurrence has changed. And the reason why is that they now have controls in place. And remember, I told you controls is just another way of saying protections, or things that they have in place to protect that specific asset. So the loss of intellectual property, this time around, the control that they have in place is a firewall, right? So what we're doing, because these numbers change, our ARO would change along with our ALE, right? So let's do a couple examples, right? So theft of information by a hacker. The SLE is, actually, before we even do that, let's figure out the ARO. The frequency of occurrence for this specific incident is once every 6 months, right? Like we had this before. How many 6 months is there in a year, right? There's two sets of 6 months, if that makes sense, right? For 12 months, that equals 12 months. Or let's do once, because this one could be a bit tricky. Theft of equipment, right? This happens once every 2 years, which means you would divide 1 by 2 and you get 0.5, which means the ARO would be 0.5. And that's a bit tricky to explain, but the easy way to just say that is just divide 1 by 2 and you'll get 0.5, right? And we'll do another one for this specific threat category, viruses and worms. Happens once per month. That means, how many months is there in a year? 12, right? Okay. Now, because these numbers have changed and almost halved for some of these threat categories, the ALE has also changed. So for this table, it's the ARO was 2. In the previous table before the assessment, for that specific threat category, the ARO was 1, right? So, yes, things have changed. So keep in mind these numbers here for the cost of control. They'll be important, but they're not important now in calculating the ARO and ALE for this specific question for number 4. But now when we move to question 5, considering the table 3, why have some values changed in the cost per incident and frequency of occurrence columns? How could a control affect one but not the other? Assume the values in the cost of control column are unique costs directly associated with protecting against the threat. In other words, do not consider overlapping costs between controls. And one thing I said was some of the values have changed in comparison to the previous tables because certain variables have adjusted due to certain controls being put in place. For example, almost all of the frequency of occurrence values have changed, which leads to a definite change in both the ARO and ALE values because of the formula, right? Some controls can be set specifically for that asset and not spread out amongst the others, which can explain how some controls affect one but not the other. So next is the last part, right? Number 6. Using the data in exercise 2 and 4, calculate the CBA for the planned risk control approach in each threat category. For each threat category, determine whether the proposed control is worth the cost. Okay. Now, CBA stands for cost benefit analysis. Now, the formula for finding the cost benefit analysis is taking the ALE prior to the assessment. So the ALE prior to the assessment would be the values that we have in the first table after finding the ALE in the first table in question 2, right? Minus the ALE after the assessment, so post-assessment ALE, which is the values we found in question 4, right? Minus the cost of controls, which is these numbers here that I told you guys to remember about, to keep in mind of. So after doing that, I didn't write it out completely. I already found the CBA. So let's go back up here and do an example, right? So we'll do one for theft of equipment, right? So let's go back up to the first table, pre-assessment, theft of equipment, right? The ALE for theft of equipment in the first table is $1,000, right? So we'll take that $1,000 and the ALE pre-assessment and then we'll go to the next table, post-assessment, and see that the ALE is $500, right? So that's 1,000 minus 500, and then we'll go to the cost of controls, right, which is 15,000. So that's 500 minus 15,000, which ends up being negative 14,500. You can get negative numbers, which means that the company is operating at a loss, which is a bad thing. And you'll mention that after finding the CBA, because some of the CBAs that you find for each threat category end up being negative, and these numbers that are red were the ones that came up negative. So yeah, after doing that, that's pretty much it. And so after that second part of the question, you'll go back, look over the table, and see which ones weren't really worth the cost of putting a control in place, or there's a better control, possibly a better control that could have been put in place that could have cost less for that specific threat category. So yeah, if you guys have any other questions or concerns, please email me back, and I'll try to have this uploaded as quick as possible on YouTube. And yeah, have a good one.